Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's Talk Consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing very well today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today in the Voice of Yoga, we will talk about the idea of balancing accounts with the divine principle as opposed to mere human opinion. Listen as we explain how to use the testimony of the corporeal senses to determine conscious realization of divine truth. In this show, we will discuss some ways of taking the guesswork out of attaining spiritual identity. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and walk in the kingdom of heaven on earth. Swami, today's title of the show is Reconcile Accounts with the Divine. So let's get started. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, in the same way that you would reconcile your checking account against what you have in the bank and how much you've spent. In a similar way, we use the testimony of our corporeal senses to give us clues as to how well we are attuned to the divine idea. Learning to live from the perspective of divine perfection and not the mental, material, mortal sense of things. Gilbert Carpenter wrote in 500 Watching Points, and I'll read it. Is it not error to cherish the notion that the ability to comprehend the deep things of God is a developed quality attained through study and application alone? True, such study and application are needed in order to know what it is that prevents students from expressing and voicing the mind that was in Christ Jesus. A thing divinely and scientifically natural to the one whose thought is freed from the influence of mortal mind. The student's higher task is to empty his thought so that the deep things of God may flow in. End of quote. Like we say, you can't just make a blanket statement that the principles of mathematics are perfect. Therefore, my checking account is perfect. There is this reconciliation that has to take place. You have to apply the principles of mathematics to the amount of money you have in the bank next to the amount of money you are spending. We know that the mental material concept of life is not quote-unquote real, but the more divinely mental, the more harmonious and indestructible it will appear. Yes, it's true, we are all the reflection of the divine, but we are not all equally conscious or sensitive to that awareness, and so as a result, we're not all reflecting the perfection of being. In fact, that's what we want to learn, is how close am I to reflecting the divine? Am I sowing to the spirit or am I sowing to the flesh? And so here in this show, we really want to focus on, well, how do we balance this experience of life next to the divine creation?
I really like that phrase that Gilbert Carpenter uses when he says developed quality. It makes me think I have to do something. I have to maybe work on developing this attained study, this application, have to develop it, and yet it also has to have a sense of quality too to it.
Right, but he also says, isn't it error to cherish the notion that the ability to comprehend the deep things of God is a developed quality? We really don't make ourselves spiritual. We recognize the truth. We get out of the concept that doesn't reflect the divine. Now, Gilbert Carpenter understands that, but he also understands that we need the letter of the truth and the spirit of the truth. That it's the spirit of the truth that will reveal this divine creation. But unless we have that revelation, the letter of the truth becomes the path, the way of being able to come out of the false sense of life and then live under the government of the divine creation.
So then how do you recommend we get started? We want to make sure that we don't do it through what he was saying. We don't comprehend it just through studies, but we want to do it through application as well, I think is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, the way that I try and understand this now is understanding a process. We graduate from thinking with our 5 material senses. And by stopping thinking, making the mind aware for the presence of the divine creation, in silence and stillness, we watch, we wait, we listen, and we let divine truth reveal itself to us. Thinking is how we create the veil. But there are modes of thinking. We stop thinking, forming thoughts and opinions with the material senses, and then in this silence and stillness, we awaken the spiritual senses. We begin to activate spiritual sense. What was called the birth of Christ. The birth of Christ in consciousness is when your spiritual senses are activated. And now you are able to comprehend that which was invisible and intangible to your material senses is revealing a completely different new world, a new creation that is very different than the one your material senses exist in. The new world is absolute. It's whole. It's complete. It's perfect. And then, of course, how we think is what we become. So once we start thinking with our spiritual senses, when spirit is cause, creation is perfect. When spirit is unconscious, the mental material image is imperfect. How we think is what we become, and even though the mental material image isn't real, it is the check engine light on the dashboard of consciousness. So use the testimony of the 5 material senses to let you know what you are conscious of.
We have a soundbite here from Herb Fitch, and this is from his class Realization of Oneness, class 15B, that we can play now.
Yeah, and if anybody is interested in the whole audio file or the complete program, you can get this at mysticalprinciples.com, and I'll play it.
Resting in the Christ everywhere is resting in oneness, for the Christ is one with the Father. Now, isn't that past just knowing truth? You see, it's the habits that you set up. The instant reflex of the senses throws all this out the window. And so you have to readjust those reflexes. You have to consciously not make contact with your environment through senses, but consciously make contact with the invisible environment through the Christ. You don't do that accidentally. You do that through concentrated desire to love God supremely, to be yourself, to take all of this great world message that has been set into the consciousness of man by the Christ, and to fall prostrate before it, to throw yourself at its feet and say, thank you for giving me the key to the kingdom, to unlock the prison of the mind. And you turn from that mind, and you live. Evil can only persecute your false sense of self. Every error that attacks you is attacking only your false sense of self. Error never attacks the reality of you. It never attacks who you are. It attacks who you are not. Give it some thought. Every time you feel harassed, try to remember that evil is attacking that which you are not. Nothing attacks Christ. It can't even find Christ. Shuffle off the false sense and watch the evil go with it. I don't know if we can continue. I'd like to, but let's see what we have here. All right, we'll sum it up this way from Joel. From morning to night, your stand must be, there is one power. And I, says Joel, do not say this lightly. I'm aware of all the appearances there are in the world and the claims of power that exist. But if you're going to live the spiritual life, you must come to the point where Adam and Eve were before they had eaten of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. You must come to the point where you don't believe there's good matter and bad matter. As long as you've got good matter but no bad matter, you're not very far along. When you know that there are not two powers, a spiritual power and a material power, that's the point. There is no material power in the consciousness of spirit that is demonstrated. Then you're back in the Garden of Eden.
So it seems to me that what he's telling us is exactly what the Bible is telling us. Like, I like when he says, when you do that through concentrated desire to love God supremely. And isn't that what the Bible tells us to do?
Right. And then what we have to interpret is, what does the Bible mean when it says to love God? Because it doesn't mean that we love God in the way that we love one another. That's why Jesus said to his apostles, love one another as I have loved you. Divine love is very different than this human concept of love. Divine love is, like he started out, resting in the Christ everywhere, is resting in oneness. For the Christ is one with the Father. This idea of one being, one perfect divine life is the only reality. It's the only self-existent power in this universe. Now, what we are calling life and this mental material concept isn't real. As Mary Baker Eddy said in Science and Health, there's no life, truth, intelligence, or substance in matter. Even science today is telling us what we're calling life is observation dependent, and it's the observer that sets the measurement for the collapse of the wave function. This mental material concept is really just a veil, preventing us from seeing what's really here. And what we're learning is how to actualize this, how to experience the divine creation, because you can't do it as a mortal human being. You can't do it with the mind we're using to get us through this lifetime. So we have to repent, which means think differently.
So you say we have to think differently, and then earlier you had talked about modes of thinking. So which mode do we need to think differently? So what does it look like when we're doing it?
Yeah, when we graduate from thinking with the 5 material senses and come out of the 3 modes of mortal thought Mary Baker Eddy talked about in Science and Health. In Revelations, they refer to it as the dragon and 2 beasts. Mortal mind works in duality. It works in contrast. It's a divided consciousness, whereas divine mind works in the absolute. Now, what we use here is we use the zodiac to help us understand this. The modes of mortal thought, the modes of thinking are represented by the mutable signs. Gemini would be the lower mind. Virgo would be what we call the mid-mind, which is human intelligence. Sagittarius is what we call the higher mind or the collective consciousness. And Pisces is divine mind. That's the final stage of the zodiac, the 12th sign. And once we know or realize the omnipresence of the one mind, that dissolves the belief in the lower mind, which is instinct, appetite, preservation, survival, what Mary Baker Eddy called animal magnetism. The mid-mind, which is human intelligence, our ability to develop these mental functions, perception, reason, memory, intuition. And then the higher mind, the ability to work with a mind that is not limited to just doing one thing at a time. But the higher mind can do many things at once. In the same way, the part of your mind that is controlling your heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature simultaneously. But divine mind does everything at once, and it works in the absolute. There's no division, there's no contrast, it's not dualistic.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Asana class is a module fitting into the master plan, leading the practitioner to the experience of total consciousness by attuning the mind-body complex to the divine idea. A system of exercises designed to use the physical appearance to determine individual level of consciousness and degree of awareness, starting with the process of lengthening and strengthening muscles to bring bones into the position of internal support. We educate thought up to spiritual apprehension, because when spirit is cause, it calls into expression the beauty of holiness, making creation perfect. Mountain pose may not bring you truth in consciousness, but truth in consciousness must bring mountain pose. Visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those who are just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So let's get back to that soundbite from Herb Fitch. And I want to talk about a statement that he made, and I'll read it. Evil can only persecute your false sense of self. So I'm wondering if we could maybe break that down a little bit and tell our listeners, what does that look like when that happens?
Yeah, the idea of the physics of spirituality, like attracts like. And so if we identify with things that are visible and tangible, or things that are invisible but tangible, we are attracted to duality. Duality is a belief in two powers. The entire thing works on contrast. As long as we believe in duality, we believe in good and evil, then we attract this law of karma into our experiences. Once we come out of the belief in duality and we accept this unified state of consciousness, we accept oneness, only one life without opposite. And not just think about it, but to be one with the divine, you become subject to the divine law, and you are immune to the law of karma. You no longer have a belief in two powers. Again, coming back to this process, we graduate from thinking with these different modes of mortal mind to knowing with the divine mind. We're graduating from a belief in the divine creation, the perfection of being. And as your belief graduates to faith, faith is where you're starting to demonstrate your belief in the divine creation, and it is appearing in your experiences. Like Mary Baker Eddy had said, we live above corporeal sense and correct it. that implies that you have now graduated to the level of faith, which is, again, a way of reconciling your level of consciousness, your degree of awareness. And it's a way of proving that what you're believing in initially is the one true truth.
And I like what he says when he's giving us something to do. Every time you feel harassed, try to remember that evil is attacking that which you are not. So I think we just have to try to do just that. If we're having some kind of discord or negative response to something, we have to remember that the evil isn't attacking us.
I like to do things more from a positive side. Coming from an athletic background, playing ice hockey, offense was our best defense. So knowing the truth, knowing who you are, not focusing on who you are not. Knowing who you are when the invisible, intangible omnipresence becomes visible and tangible to you, then you never fall back into the trap. Your whole sense of self is associated with your spiritual senses. You have a different operation of your material senses, not the primary, they are more secondary. More and more reliant on the testimony of your spiritual senses as opposed to the testimony of the material senses. But again, it's going to be 180 degrees from the way we're socialized. The medical model examines the body. X-rays don't lie. This is the lie. And once you have elevated and educated your thought up to that, not just belief without proof, but this certain degree of trust without reservation until your belief becomes faith. And then as you advance in your development and practicing this principle, your faith will graduate to understanding where you're able to demonstrate divine law with scientific certainty.
Yeah, and again, I like when he says towards the end, when you know that there are not two powers, a spiritual power and a material power, that's the point. It sounds so simple, but that's exactly what we have to do, is come to this realization there isn't two, there's only one.
Right, and what he said there, the point where Adam and Eve were before they had eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And for each and every one of us, that's that point before we accepted mortality, before we accepted this life that believes in two powers. And again, on a positive side, by affirming the truth, identifying with the one life, the invisible, intangible omnipresence.
So let's talk more about this concept of like attracts like that you had said a little earlier in the program.
Yeah, to invite divine mind into consciousness, we must create a hospitable environment. Like you say, like attracts like. And the language of spirit is silence. The activity of spirit is stillness. So we stop thinking and we point the field of awareness to the invisible, intangible omnipresence and wait on the Lord. Rest in the knowledge of the perfection of being. Watch, wait, listen, and let divine truth reveal itself to you. In the light of the divine principle, only truth exists. It dissolves the false sense of life, leaving only the omnipresence of the one perfect divine life. And then we begin to understand when we're trying, striving, struggling, seeking, planning, even asking, we're interfering with this divine principle, the law of one. which rests in perfect divine harmony. There's never anything that needs to be added to it or taken away from it. It is the changeless state of being. And the more we start to acquire a taste for this peace, the peace that passes understanding, and we begin to use that as our symbol for validation, our symbol for letting us know that I'm okay. And the searching stops. And to accept and live in the knowledge of that spiritual self then begins to take care of what seemed to be a personal physical sense of self.
So we have a verse here from John 4:23 and 24, and I'll read it. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth.
Yeah, spiritual identity, to know yourself in the way that you are known by the Creator. The idea of imitation being the highest form of praise here, by us identifying with ourselves spiritually. I am one. I am everywhere, always. We come out of the veil. We come out of all of the obstructions preventing us from seeing this truth. The one life looking at itself, as itself, of itself, to itself. And it knows only the perfection of being. It knows only eternal life. And when we are not experiencing that, we now know that we are thinking about life. We are in the wrong self.
So I'm curious about the phrase, true worshipers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the more you start to understand the Christ and the message that Jesus was trying to give, he thought that the entire human experience was the lie, and that there is only one truth, one perfect divine life. And for those of us that knew ourselves in that way, they were called sons of God, the sons of men. Very different than the children of women, very different than the mortal sense of life. And the more we experience separating identity from the physical, mental concept of life, understanding yourself as an eternal spiritual being, not thinking about being spiritual, but like we say, to be able to demonstrate the omnipresence of the divine principle as who I am. That becomes visible and tangible to those that know themselves in the way that they're created. And this is what we're talking about. Reconcile your accounts according to the divine. Don't accept the mental material beliefs, the universal beliefs into powers anymore. To challenge your concept of God isn't being unfaithful to God, but it is removing the insult that your God is an imperfect God and makes mistakes.
Well, we're at the end of our program for today, so listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages, when you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you can press that could further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and walk in the kingdom of heaven on earth. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.